Hi, everybody, and welcome back for Methods in Psychology, Chapter 2. This is really the spot I wanted to begin, thinking about what makes psychology a science. How do we learn about animal and human behavior? Is it as simple as just we can look and see the things that are happening and we know what causes them to occur? Throughout this chapter, which I'll forewarn you, I'm going to break up into probably three different sections. We're going to think about various methods that psychologists use to understand the world we're in. First, we'll start with an overview. Empiricism. How do we know stuff? What methods do we use to understand what people do? And I recognize largely what psychologists do is about people, so that's why we'll focus largely on human content. Methods of explanation. Why do people do what they do? It's one thing to know that we do things, but it's another to know why we do them. We have to think critically about the evidence we're presented, and ultimately some ethics of science, doing what's right. The scientific method is effectively a set of principles about the appropriate relationship between ideas using empirical evidence. Empiricism, though, is the belief that information can be acquired through observation, which is an essential element in the scientific method. The challenge, as I alluded to in the first opening lecture series, is that it's really difficult to observe everything. We do have to have, for lack of a better word, faith that other scientists conducting research are doing so in a manner that we would deem appropriate, consistent with the idea that they're not somehow introducing intentionally bias or other variables that could influence the outcomes of their research. So the method really is about using a set of guidelines and principles that allow us to control, to observe, document, collect, interpret, analyze data about the things that we do the observing on. When we think about the things we see in the world, it's not uncommon to think about a hypothesis, which is really a falsifiable prediction made by a theory. So a theory is an explanation of a natural phenomenon. A theory can never be proved right, but it's our best guess as to what is going on. If you've ever been driving home in the evening, we'll say, sometimes you may notice that the car in front of us is going slowly, maybe swerving a little bit. Not a lot, but just enough to grab your attention. Why do you think that occurred? Is there anything that stands out that you can think right now would explain why someone might be driving slow, maybe slightly swerving? I'm sure some of the ideas right now are maybe they're texting and driving. Maybe they're drinking and driving. Maybe they're just tired. It's really difficult to know the why they're doing it. We can observe it. We can form a hypothesis. And I think they're doing it because of that. But what would be the overarching theory to explain why people behave the way that they do? So just because we observe behavior doesn't necessarily mean that the prediction we have about it is correct. That's why theories are critical to our understanding of science. They help explain things in a manner that would be fairly consistent. So the overarching theory then can be represented by hypotheses about how things work under various conditions. The challenge when we think of how we learn through observation, which was the basis of empiricism, is that it's really difficult sometimes to see with our own eyes the differences that exist in the real world. The image I'm showing you, um, the chapter highlights that for a long time, people were debating when a horse runs, do all its hooves hit the ground at least basically the same time? Is there always a hoof on the ground, or are they suspended in the air, like they're airborne? So some people were trying to debate effectively that no, at all times there's a hoof on the ground. While others said, no, when I watch a horse run, it seems like all four of its legs are suspended in the air, not touching the ground. And people could watch the same horse and come to two different conclusions. The empirical method sets a set of rules and techniques for observation, and people were difficult to study because of our complexity or variability, which is a way to think about our differences and how reactive we can become. There are different kinds of methods of observation, and methods of explanation must be used. What explains what we've observed? It wasn't until still photography was created that we could take successive photographs of a horse running, and you'll see that the majority of the images show that at some point in time, there's at least one hoof on the ground. But in three of those images, they're all suspended in the air. Now imagine without the evidence, we'd be left to just, well, I see this, so therefore I'm right, or no, you see this, so you're right. But now the evidence, if you look at the images, it does suggest that the horse does not have all of its legs on the ground while running. That's why the evidence of what we gather is critical in our understanding of behavior. Do we have adequate techniques that can capture behavior in a manner that allows us to truly understand the nature of what's going on? Hence, the complexities of what we see may not necessarily be exactly what has happened. The history of psychology really began in Germany in 1879. And we're not going to start there, but its inception was about introspection, thinking inwards. Psychologists were contemplating the nature of the mind by thinking about how their own minds worked. If I had you in a classroom, I could see that you all be sitting in front of me. I have no idea what you'd be thinking, though. Only you would know that. So you could, using introspection, think about your own thinking, which is really what we call metacognition today. But the history of science, and particularly psychology, is also filled with men. So where are all the women? Well, they weren't allowed to participate in higher education. Today, as of 2018, 70% of all graduate students are female. The trend or the historical perspective that females weren't permitted to do this is no longer the case. But I do recognize that the previous historical perspectives limited the education of women as well as the employment opportunities. Men and women have different interests and talents. Men are often more interested in topics scientists study, and women are more variable than men in quantitative ability and virtual spatial ability. When we think about the differences between the sexes, if you will, it's also important that we don't qualify this further to say that one sex is better than the other. No, that's not what this is saying. And that's the importance of doing science, if you will, is having the ability to understand that if you're observing something, that the conclusion really is just limited to the thing you've watched. But if there are differences between men and women, what do you think they are? Why do you think it occurs? Are they innate? Is it genetic? Are we just born different? How do you know? I'll leave those for you to ponder. The method of observation is about watching others do something and documenting it, trying to understand what they did so it's clearly written or recorded, and then why. Why did they do it? If we're going to observe someone, we're going to use our senses to learn about the property of an event or an object. So we're probably going to start with our eyes. What do we see occur? The limitation of just looking and watching things is that it's inconsistent. It doesn't give us a complete picture of what's going on because we're not interacting with people when they do stuff. We're just passively watching and recording. But we do have techniques that can overcome these limitations. There's different measurement techniques and ways to describe scenes in vivid detail to account for as much information as we can. When we measure behavior, it's really important that we define what we're talking about. The next slide will have greater information on operational definitions, construct validity, as well as having sensitive instruments to detect, the behavior that we're observing. So, an operational definition is really a description of property in measurable terms. If I asked you, how much money would you have to be rich? So, what's the operational definition of rich? You can think about your own answer. What about tired? What would be a sufficient definition that we would infer that someone would be tired? If we go ask newborn mothers, parents, what does it mean to be tired? Do we think the answer that they will give us would be adequate to characterize everyone's feelings of tired? Maybe, but maybe not. A good operational definition should have construct validity. Now, what does that even mean? A good definition basically should be valid. It should help characterize the behavior such that it's accurately being represented or observed. If I gave you a human neuropsychology test for quiz one by accident, would that be a valid measure of your knowledge of research methods? And you would say, of course it wouldn't. But if I gave you that test accidentally, I'm going to get a grade. And let's say I recognize, oops, I made a mistake. Now I'll give you, another quiz. And this time I upload a cognition quiz by accident. Am I still assessing your knowledge of intro psych? And you're going to say, no, of course not. Would you also do poorly on both measures of human neuropsych and cognitive assessments? And you'd probably say yes. For argument's sake, you're going to do equally as poorly, as you should, because you wouldn't have the requisite knowledge to perform well. So I've made two mistakes and I've reliably showed the same result: insufficient knowledge. But it's not valid. A valid assessment has to be reliable. I'm going to give you a consistent test that's going to show me that it's valid in terms of its assessment of your knowledge of this course. So if something is valid, it is reliable. But if something's reliable, it doesn't make it valid because I can reliably give you the wrong test and get inconsistent results that are not valid towards what I'm trying to measure to begin with. As you progress through your psychology careers, you'll come to know that just a basic understanding of validity and reliability is sufficient. While there are several different kinds of validities, some will argue that really it's just the general purpose of what it is that's important, not necessarily that all of them are equally reliable in their explanations of behavior. So, power, the last one point of the slide, is the ability of a measure to detect conditions specified in the operational definition. Do we have the techniques that are capable to accurately capture what we're trying to observe? And if we do, there should be a large degree of power, meaning it's captured the behavior we're trying to assess. Imagine for a second that you are watching a 100-meter sprint of Usain Bolt and the competition. Now, if you don't know who he is, he at the time was the fastest human on Earth in the 100-meter sprint. He holds the world record for 9.58 seconds. Now, Johann Blake, he ran it in 9.75 seconds. Then you might think, well, 9.58 is way faster than 9.75, but look it up on YouTube, watch it, and try to see what that difference really is. If the judges themselves don't have powerful detectors like lasers for when they cross the line, they may have mistakenly concluded that the two men were tied. It's similar of other races that we've observed. Um, Carmelita and Tori both ran the same race in 10.83 seconds. I mean, that's indistinguishable, obviously. And that's why we have to rely on photographic finishes or lasers themselves to give us information we can use to plot it, typically inserting their images, like a photograph, to figure out who has won the race. Because we may make the wrong conclusion based on what we see. And at that speed, don't blink, literally, or you won't see who finished. Demand characteristics. This is an aspect of observational settings that can cause people to behave as if they think someone else wants or expects them to behave a certain way. This can make it complicated when we watch behavior. If you were all sitting in the classroom, I have no doubt that you would be excellent students, sitting quietly, watching the lecture, writing notes. Imagine we go out into the real world, because the classroom doesn't really show me who you are. Because if you're just sitting there writing notes, I'm not really learning a lot about you. But imagine I approach you and say, we're just going to follow you for the day. We're going to record you. We want to learn about you by just watching you go about your day. You've all been in public when people pull out their cell phones. And if someone's recording something, think about how you act. Think about how it makes you feel in that moment. Is that you? Of course it's you, but how much of your behavior is really you? It's complicated when we're trying to observe people to understand what's going on because we all know that we act the way that people expect us to act. In this setting, like a classroom, you're expected to sit there quietly. In the real world, not as much. But when there's a camera there, you might think, well, this could end up on the internet. I better not do something that I would regret, whatever that might be. Whenever you feel like you can't act like yourself, it can create a challenge in understanding you, but also think of the other people we would observe. What's the real thing of behavior then? A way to try to get around the fact that people will act the way that we sometimes expect them to is to try to observe people without their knowledge. One way to do this is naturalistic observation. Let's just say I'm curious because I have kids in how children act when they're in groups. So maybe I go to the park. If you're in Sault Ste. Marie, Bellevue Park is a beautiful place to go, especially on a warm, sunny summer day. While there, maybe I sit off amongst the trees, just looking like I'm taking a break from my daily activities, but inconspicuously so that it doesn't look like I'm watching you and writing you down, notes of what's going on around me. So naturalistic observation is in the real world, gathering information unobtrusively. I don't want you to know that I'm doing it. Think about it like being a spy. I'm there, but I'm not really there. It's not supposed to be obvious that I'm taking notes about you. The reality is sometimes naturalistic observation isn't always practical because we know when we're in public, we act one way, and when we're somewhere else, like home or a nightclub, maybe we act differently than others. Some events are not naturally occurring, fair enough. Some events can only be observed through direct interaction. And even when we sit and watch people behave, does it somehow introduce observer bias? Am I making notes about these kids playing that would be consistent with, oh, that's just a kid thing to do? Maybe, but maybe not. Imagine you watch a child start acting aggressively while they're at the park. They run and they push a kid down and they start laughing. What's your conclusion? How do you know why they did it? I mean, we don't. We can just observe that it happened, but the why they did it, we can't interact. Because remember, naturalistic observation is just standing back and watching how things occurred. And your interpretation of what you see is really influenced by your own experiences or lack thereof. One of the examples the textbook uses here is how do we measure something like a pace of life, the hustle and bustle of the city street? If we were naturally observing a scene like this, I think you could see how easy it is to fit in without standing out because there's a lot of tourists, there's a lot of people, so no one's really looking and probably thinking about themselves being observed. Maybe we can record the average pace, how fast people are moving through the streets. Based on that observation, it's been documented that some countries that have a faster pace of life tend to have higher rates of heart disease. Why do you think that might be? And the fastest pedestrians we see here are the Irish on the left, and the slowest are the Romanians. But just because you walk fast, a quick pace, why would that somehow link you to heart disease? What's the connection between it, do you think? I mean, if you're walking fast, you wouldn't you argue that maybe you should be fitter? Or is it the less pressure by walking more slowly and casually and just indifferent, taking it all in? But what's linked to heart disease? Is it alcohol consumption, which I'm pretty sure the Irish probably hold the record for that? Of course, I'm just kidding. Is it food consumption? Is it a combination of the two? Again, we can observe lots of things in the real world. It's important that we think critically about the conclusions to why they would occur, what might connect the dots, if you will. Another way to help avoid people acting the way that we might think we would want them to act is to try to do things where there's privacy, there's some control in the environment we're doing things, but importantly, they're unaware that they're being observed. The image on the right shows that when you're bored, your pupils themselves have a smaller diameter than when you're interested in something. Your pupils dilate. So they're a little bit wider when we're really engaged and curious in something, which can be a useful measure in examining what level of engagement you have with something you're looking at in the environment. We can find creative ways to show some kind of engagement, but to be pretty obvious, the thing that's lacking is we don't know what they're engaged in. So we'd have to make sure we control the ability to see what did you look at that resulted in a change of behavior. When we observe the world, especially as a scientist, we have an idea of what we think is happening. Because I have that expectation of what I should see, it can create some kind of observer bias where I'm going to look at something that's going to have some kind of expectation built into the behavior I'm watching, which might influence what's actually happening. Why does this occur? Well, our expectations can influence our observations. Remember, you have this great big brain, and this brain is almost, you can think of it as a predictive machine. It's trying to expect and anticipate what would happen next. Our expectations of what could happen can influence the reality of what we see. Imagine if I said to you, oh, there was a car accident. In fact, you can watch the video of it. And I asked you after you watched the video, how fast do you think the car was going when it bumped into the other car? And you might describe the scene consistent with how a car was moving when it bumped another car. But if I showed another group of people the same video and I said to them, how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car? The question's the same with one exception. Bump has been replaced, with smashed. So how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other one? Right now, you're probably thinking if cars smash into each other, they're traveling at a faster speed. So people will describe it increased velocity. What happens to the vehicles when they bump each other versus when they smash into each other? The fact is, people will misremember that when cars smash into each other, the glass breaks. And when you watch the video, it doesn't. We understand through studying people that you expect things to look the way they do based on sometimes how we ask a question. So it's important if we want to avoid some of the biases that can be observed and then embedded in research, we can create studies that are double blind. You don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. And then we have a research assistant who's going to carry out the study who knows what they're administering, but I don't know what they're doing as the head researcher, and I don't know what you're getting, and you don't know what you're getting. So everyone's effectively double blind to the study. Imagine we think about going to buy something. And a good example of this here of age, if you go to the liquor store, you'll see, especially for wine, people rate it out of 100, a different score. And not all the wines are rated, but some of the ones that they're really trying to sell and market, it's really strategic that you share the score, especially if it's a good one. Now, Robert Parker is one of the world's most foremost wine critics. And if he rates a wine as good, how do you think it'll influence what people think the wine should taste like? Will his ratings, with all of his knowledge, influence our perception of how something tastes? What do you think? What if I put in front of you a glass of white wine? How do you think it would taste? And you would probably think, well, it would taste like white wine, however white wine tastes. And if I put another glass of wine in front of you that happens to look red, like you see in the image in front of you, how do you think that would taste? And you'd probably say the way that red wine tastes. Now, I recognize that they have different grapes that they use through the fermentation process to create the different kinds of wines available. But let's just ignore that for a second. But what if I told you that the red wine was the same white wine, but dyed with food coloring to look red? Would you notice? When we look at things in the world, we kind of expect them to be a certain way, to be good or bad, the qualifiers we typically use. And when we study behavior, it's fascinating to really think about the what influences your perception of a thing. I remember vividly visiting my uncle one time, and he was sharing wine with myself and my other family members who were there, so his brothers at the time. And I remember his brothers saying, like, this is really kind of you. We really appreciate you giving us wine all night. And the reality is, my uncle has a really, really good wine cellar. He has very expensive bottles of wine. And my uncle's thought he's down there going through the cellar and bringing up, and getting them really expensive wine. So they're appreciative of the fact that he's doing this. He doesn't want anything from them. but their perception of the wine they're drinking is this is really good because we're in a nice house, which has nice wine with great food, and their perception of this wine is it's outstanding. My uncle laughed and told them that the wine was only 14.95 at the LCBO. Sometimes we're in places where we expect things to be good because everything else around us, if you will, is good. When you go to a fine dining restaurant, think of how the food is presented. How is it that the way we present things affects its perception, its taste? And certainly it's the case that if a wine rating is very positive, that people might buy it because, well, so and so thinks so highly of it that so should I. No, I believe the research has shown that with wine tasting, anything basically under, let's say, about 28, $30, you really can notice the difference. But above the $30 bottles of wine, they all really perform well, meaning a $30 bottle of wine, people will rate as tasting just as good as a $130 bottle of wine. But you can discriminate the $30 from like a $15 bottle of wine, as an example. So this is to say that we know behavior is complicated. We know that we can be influenced by others. You know you've been influenced by others, your friends, and so on, to do things that we do. And it's not a bad thing. It's why we study people to understand that behavior amongst others. So observation is an important component in assessing what's going on around us. Doing so requires clever skills, ingenuity sometimes, but it's also complicated. And it doesn't mean that just because we observe something that we really see what's going on. We see the truth as to why they act the way that they do or don't. We're going to pause this lesson here before we jump into the statistical pieces of understanding behavior. I hope you've enjoyed the methods chapter thus far, and we'll continue here in the next series. For now, I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye for now.